What was it like to live in Russia between 1650 and 1700? We often hear about kings, tsars, and great battles. But the real heartbeat of history lies in the lives of ordinary people. This was an age of hunger and hope, rebellion and resilience, where wars shaped borders and peasants shaped survival. In this journey we'll uncover forgotten truths, the wars that scarred the land, the games children invented to keep joy alive, the foods that kept families from starving, and the faith that carried them through darkness. This is not just history. This is the untold story of a people who refused to break, even when the world around them was crumbling. The Russia of the mid-1600s was a land of contrasts, both vast and fragile. On one hand, golden church domes pierced the sky, signaling faith and resilience. On the other, peasants lived in huts of wood and clay, bound by hardship and uncertainty. The scars of the time of troubles were still fresh, but the country was beginning to steady itself under the Romanov dynasty. Yet this calm was deceptive. Russia was surrounded by rivals: Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, the Crimean Tatars, and the Ottoman Empire. Peasants became more tightly bound to the land under serfdom. Nobles grew richer and more powerful, and whispers of change carried through villages and towns. Russia was stepping toward modernity, but every step came with a cost. The second half of the 17th century was drenched in conflict. The Russo-Polish War of 1654-1667 carved new borders, and the Andrusovo Treaty brought Ukraine's East Bank under Moscow's control. But every victory demanded a price in blood and grain. Fields were burned, villages emptied, and famine stalked the land like a shadow. When armies marched, peasants bore the heaviest weight. Crops rotted in fields left untended, livestock vanished to feed soldiers, and entire communities fled into forests to escape. In some years, hunger killed more people than swords or muskets. Bread became so precious that peasants ground bark and grass into their flour. Families preserved mushrooms, berries, and roots. They bartered with passing merchants for salt, the key to keeping meat edible through winter. Even in famine, life continued. Babies were born, weddings held, and church bells still rang. The endurance of the people was Russia's quiet, unshakable weapon. If wars weakened Russia, rebellion threatened to tear it apart from within. In 1670, Stenka Razin, a charismatic Cossack leader, ignited the Volga region with promises of freedom. To the peasants, crushed by taxes and noble power, Razin seemed like a savior. His men stormed towns, seized forts, and declared a world where peasants would be free. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Thousands joined him, waving banners of liberation, but the state struck back with brutal force. Razin's followers were scattered, captured, or executed. Razin himself was dragged to Moscow and executed in 1671. His body made an example to all. Yet the rebellion was more than a failed uprising. It was a warning. Beneath the surface of Russia's rigid hierarchy there was fire, a fire that could not be extinguished, only contained. Russia's northern lands told a different story of struggle. Here the wars were with Sweden and revolved around icy rivers, fortresses, and fragile trade routes. The White Sea and Arkhangelsk were Russia's window to Europe, and Moscow would not allow it to be shut. Campaigns in the north were grueling. Armies slogged through swamps and forests, fighting not only soldiers but the merciless cold. Horses froze where they stood, villages emptied under the weight of passing armies. Northern peasants learned to endure with stubborn patience. They salted fish in barrels, hunted elk and reindeer, and hid their families deep in the forests when soldiers came. Their struggle was quieter than rebellion, but no less heroic. In the north, survival meant bending without breaking, outlasting not only enemies but winter itself. If the north demanded patience, the south demanded vigilance. The open steppes were a highway for raiders: Crimean Tatars, Nogai horsemen, and Ottoman-backed forces. Their raids were swift and merciless. Entire villages vanished overnight, their people dragged into slavery. To survive, peasants of the south lived lightly. Homes were built to be rebuilt, herds could be moved quickly, wagons always ready to flee. The Cossacks became both sword and shield, defending rivers and fighting back against invaders. Their reputation grew not just as warriors, but as symbols of freedom, living beyond the grasp of Moscow's nobles. This was the land of Stenka Razin's fire, where rebellion felt like destiny. Here, survival meant constant readiness. Where the north clung to stillness, the south learned to dance with chaos. To understand Russia, one must understand its peasants. Bound by serfdom, most had little freedom, yet they carried the nation on their backs. Families lived in wooden huts with clay ovens at their heart, ovens that warmed, cooked, and even served as beds in winter. Life was communal. Villages worked fields together, shared tools, and celebrated festivals as one. Religion was inseparable from daily life. Icons hung in every home, and priests reminded peasants that suffering was part of their path to salvation. They endured through rhythm, the rhythm of planting, harvesting, praying, and celebrating. They endured because they had no choice. But within this endurance was resilience that rulers and nobles often underestimated. Even in hardship, joy and comfort existed. Russian peasants nourished themselves with rye bread, dense and dark, and endless bowls of cabbage soup, or shchi. On feast days, dumplings, pickled vegetables, salted fish, and honey-sweetened drinks transformed the table into celebration. Cellars brimmed with sauerkraut, cucumbers, and dried mushrooms, the lifeline through harsh winters. Kvass, the humble drink of fermented bread, refreshed farmers after long days in the fields. Around the stove, families ate, sang, and shared stories. Food was survival, but it was also community. Children filled their days with laughter. They played lapta, a baton ball game like a distant cousin of baseball, or raced sleds across frozen rivers. Wooden toys, rag dolls, and clay whistles were treasures beyond price. Even chores turned playful, with songs and clapping games echoing through villages. Food and play were not luxuries. They were reminders that life was worth living even when the world seemed unkind. Amid wars and hardship, another struggle brewed within the church. Patriarch Nikon's reforms in the 1650s split Russian Orthodoxy in two. Those who resisted, the old believers, faced exile, torture, and execution. Yet they clung to their faith with ferocity. Entire villages fled into forests and remote wilderness, carrying their traditions with them. They built hidden churches, passed down secret prayers, and refused to let Moscow dictate their path to God. Their persecution was fierce, but their resilience legendary. In many ways, their story reflected Russia itself, scarred, stubborn, and unwilling to surrender. As the century closed, a boy named Peter rose from obscurity. He would become Peter the Great, the ruler who dragged Russia into modern Europe. But in 1650-1700, he was still learning, watching, and growing in a world torn between old and new. Russia of this era was shaped by war, famine, rebellion, and survival. Yet through it all, its people endured, not because life was easy, but because they found strength in food, faith, community, and sheer resilience. The story of Russia was not just the story of czars and wars. It was the story of ordinary people who lived, suffered, laughed, and dreamed, and who built a nation strong enough to change the world. As the century drew to a close, Russia stood on the edge of transformation. The wars, famines, and rebellions of 1650 to 1700 were not just scars, they were stepping stones toward a new world. From the frozen north to the restless south, from the humble peasant to the rising czar, every struggle carved the soul of a nation. Russia was not built in palaces or on battlefields alone. It was built in smoky kitchens where cabbage soup bubbled, in fields where peasants bent their backs, in forests where rebels plotted, and in churches where prayers whispered against the storm. This was Russia's hidden life, a story of endurance, courage, and hope. A reminder that history is not only about rulers but about people who, against all odds, kept the flame of life burning through the darkest nights.